Hello and welcome back to the channel. With Halloween approaching and being somewhat interested in the supernatural as well as our usual historical content, we decided to go and explore Pendle Hill in Lancashire this week, a location steeped in spooky history. The following dark and fantastical story is what we discovered about the area and its historical characters. At the end of the 17th century, England was under the rule of James I, son of Mary, Queen of Scots. One of the first pieces of legislation passed by King James in 1604 was the Witchcraft Act, an act that imposed harsh penalties on anyone practicing witchcraft, and indeed anyone associated with it. Following the Berwick witch trials of 1590, James had studied witchcraft in depth and even wrote a book on the subject in 1597 entitled Demonology. It was a stark warning against the evil practice of witchcraft and the occult, and used the Bible as well as various intellectual works as evidence and justification for King James' passionate view on the subject. At this time, outbreaks of witchcraft in England were inconsistent and usually restricted to poorer rural areas. Whilst convictions of women who practiced the art were far more common than men, they were not exclusive to them, with around a quarter of convictions and executions being of males. At a time where people were still God-fearing, and in small rural communities where everyone knew everyone else, where poverty was rife and scraping a living was difficult. It only took one unexpected tragic event for fingers to be pointed towards one's neighbour and cries of witchcraft to be uttered to anyone willing to listen. It was in this social climate, in the depths of rural Lancashire, under the looming shadow of Pendle Hill, that we begin our tale of the Pendle Witches. The main protagonists of this dark and complicated tale hail from two families in particular. The Device family, of whom the matriarch was one Elizabeth Southern, nicknamed Old Demik, and the Whittle family, the matriarch being Anne Whittle, nicknamed Old Chattocks. Whether you believe in witchcraft or not, the story that follows leaves little room for doubt of the wicked intentions of these two old crones, even if evidence against other family members and their associates, who were also accused, is scant. Events begin one early spring day in March 1612, when Alison Device, Old Demdike's granddaughter, was on the road to Colne, begging. The Device family was very poor and scraped a living by begging and doing odd jobs for their slightly better off neighbours. It was on this spring day, whilst begging, that Alison Device encountered a pedlar by the name of John Law. Alison asked John to give her some pins, for what purpose we do not know. But he refused her, obviously realizing that she could not pay. Alison was not happy with his response, and it was at this point, allegedly, that her spirit familiar in the form of a black dog appeared and asked if she would like him to exact revenge on the peddler. Alison thought about it, and after some consideration told him that, yes, she would like him to make the peddler lame. Moments later, John Law fell to the ground, reportedly paralysed down one side and unable to speak. Now, at this point, you may well be wondering how we know about these events, bearing in mind they occurred over 400 years ago. Well, We have a man by the name of Thomas Potts to thank for his record of events entitled The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster. Thomas was present for much of the interrogation and trials of the later accused. How much of his account is skewed by fear and personal opinion, of course, we can never know. So, John Law was taken, paralysed and fearful, to a local alehouse where he remained for some weeks. But it was only when his son, Abraham, arrived that he considered reporting Alison Device to the appropriate authorities. Abraham, convinced that his father had been the victim of witchcraft, went off to report his father's condition and the event which had led up to it to the local Justice of the Peace, Roger Noel, who, having had some experience of witchcraft himself, wasted no time in bringing Alison Device to Reed Hall for questioning. As it transpired, not much questioning was required, as Alison readily confessed to having lamed John Law, and also told of her familiar spirit and how he had sucked her blood. In our modern world, the mind can only boggle as to why someone would so easily confess to such fantastical things. As if this wasn't enough, she painted a picture of the very dark past of her family, and in particular her grandmother, Elizabeth Southern, also known as Old Demdike, who, she stated, had a very long past as a witch. She told tales of her grandmother bewitching to death the daughter of a man named Richard Baldwin, as well as causing the death of another boy by fashioning a clay figure of him and slowly crumbling it. It was clear to Roger Noel that further questioning was required. On the 2nd of April, 1612, Old Demdike was brought in for questioning. Thomas Potts describes her as a damnable and malicious witch, a sink of villainy and mischief. She was a very old woman, about the age of 80 years, and had been a witch for 50 years. She dwelt in the forest of Pendle. Here she brought up her own children, instructing her grandchildren, and took great care and pains to bring them up as witches. She was a general agent of evil. No man escaped her or her furies. A story was told to Noel of how Old Demdike many years prior had sold her soul to the devil. She had, she said, met a spirit on the way home from begging one day. This spirit took the form of a boy who wore a coat, one half black and the other half brown. This boy stopped her and informed her that if she would give him her soul, she could ask of him anything she wanted. First, though, she demanded to know his name and was told it was Tib. Furnished with this information, she agreed to this deal. Being as poor as she was, the temptation must have been great. However, for a good 5 or 6 years she requested nothing of her familiar despite his recurring visits. Finally, one day he visited her in the form of a black dog while she was taking a nap, jumped into her lap, and proceeded to suck blood from under her left arm. When she awoke, the dog vanished, leaving her in a state of madness for around 2 months. Demdike confessed readily to all of this and was, it seems, happy to implicate others. She told Noel that Richard Baldwin had threatened her and her daughter, screaming at them, "Get out of my ground, you whores and witches! I will burn one of you and hang the other!" Her dog familiar had then appeared and offered to exact revenge on her behalf. Shortly after this, Baldwin's daughter had died. Demik also described in some detail the method of causing death by using a clay likeness which could be used to either inflict pain or death. It is at this point we first hear of Anne Whittle, also known as Old Chattox, who Demik claimed was an expert in this art. She told of how she had once encountered Chattox and her daughter Anne Redfern making clay figures of a man named Robert Nutter and other members of his family in the company of a black cat familiar. Within days, Nutter was dead. And so, Anne Whittle was now brought in for questioning. She also told tales of demonic pacts and familiar spirits. Thomas Potts describes her as a very old, withered, spent and decrepit creature, a sight almost gone. A dangerous witch of very long continuance, always opposite to Demik. In her witchcraft, always more ready to do mischief to men's goods than themselves, her lips ever chattering and walking. But what she says no man knows. Chattox claimed to have been initiated into witchcraft some 14 years prior by none other than old Demik herself. She stated that the devil had appeared to her at Demik's house and asked her for her soul, to which she had no hesitation in offering up. This devil then apparently sucked the blood from her right side near her ribs. She and Demik had then feasted on food that had been provided by their respective familiars, Chattox's being a young man she called Fancy, and of course Demik's familiar, Tibbs. As if the story couldn't get much darker or complex, Chattox went on to implicate Demik in two further deaths, those of Richard Assheton of Downham and Robert Nutter. At this point, the four women, Alison Device, Old Demik, Old Chattox and Anne Redfern, were arrested and taken off to jail at Lancaster Castle to await trial. On Good Friday, April 20th, 1612, also apparently the Witches' Sabbath, a meeting was held at Malin Tower, the home of the Device family. Although the name sounds somewhat grand, the property was probably little more than a run-down old cottage. Elizabeth Device, being in shock and panic at the arrest of her mother and daughter, organised the meeting with family friends and ordered her son James to steal a sheep for them to feast on. Present at the meeting were Elizabeth Device, James Device, Christopher Howgate and his wife, Catherine Hewitt, John Bulcock and his mother Jane, and Alice Nutter. Elizabeth's youngest daughter, Janet Device, was also present in the house, although she was only 9 years old. We hear from Thomas Potts that during this meeting, it was decided that the governor of Lancaster Castle should be killed and that the castle should be blown up in order to free the Pendle prisoners. Shortly after the meeting, Christopher Howgate and his wife, perhaps predicting the outcome of such a meeting, fled the country. Much of the events of the meeting were recounted to Roger Noel by the 9-year-old Janet Device, who proved to be a star witness in the case, and so, by the end of April, 10 alleged witnesses from Pendle sat in the dungeons of Lancaster Castle, awaiting their fate. Their cases were not to be tried for another 4 months, however. What would happen to these wicked individuals? Find out on Tuesday the 31st of October, when we shall continue with the story of their trials, which reveal even darker, more wicked deeds than you thought possible. Goodbye for now.